We are now recording. Welcome, everyone. So happy to see you all here on this beautiful day. Really appreciate that Angélica Cházaro agreed to be with us today, to share her knowledge. Just really glad to be here. So I am Judy Rohr. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the director of Gender, Women's, and Sexuality Studies here at EWU. This is a super busy time, I know, for everyone, but this is also such an important topic, or maybe I should say a critical topic, right? So I'm really glad that we can be learning from each other and from Angélica. So the erasure of histories of oppression is really part of what we're going to be talking about today. So it's important for us to think about whose land we're on. Although we are meeting virtually, we are all still physically located on somebody's homelands. There are 8 major tribes or confederations in the eastern region of what we now call Washington State. Those are the Spokane, Kalispell, Colville, Yakima, Umatilla, Warm Springs, Nez Perce, and Coeur d'Alene. As part of our decolonial practice in Gender, Women's, and Sexuality Studies, we encourage those of us who are non-native to acknowledge that we are on other people's lands and to find ways to support their self-determination. I also want to acknowledge the folks who put in the labor to make this event possible. GWSS, as many of you know, is understaffed right now. So I reached out and got just incredible help with publicity, including the beautiful flyer from Amy Lukowski in the library. The Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion stepped in to help with registration, including just now. So thank you, Stephanie Bradley, for that help and for help with the Zoom. Finally, many thanks to our co-sponsors for today. They are Africana Studies, American Indian Studies, Chicanx Studies, Faculty Commons, and the Honors Program. I am so pleased that we have Angélica Cházaro with us today. She's going to present until about 4:45, and then we're going to have time for questions. Please post your questions into the chat towards the end of her presentation. It's just Stephanie and I and Angélica who are managing. So we'll do our best to get to your questions or consolidate them or pull them together. At 5 o'clock, we're going to end the open discussion, and I'm going to ask the balance of you to leave, and then my fantastic 19 students are going to remain in the room and be able to engage more with Angélica. So Angélica Cházaro writes, organizes, and teaches about immigration, abolition, and the carceral state. She teaches at University of Washington School of Law and previously worked with the Northwestern Immigrant Rights Project, specializing in representing immigrant survivors of violence. She is organized to end immigrant detention in Washington, stop the construction of a youth jail and court in King County, Washington, shut down an adult jail in King County, defund the Seattle police, and invest in Black and Brown communities. So please help me virtually in welcoming Angélica.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for spending this, what seems like both a gorgeous afternoon here in Seattle and in Spokane with me. I'm excited and really grateful to Judy for the invitation and to everybody who made this event possible. I'm really glad to be here and sharing with you all. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I have some slides to help you all follow along. I've also got some notes because I've had a sick kid, so I've been up at nights and my brain is working a little less quickly than usual, but we're gonna make it through together. Let me make sure I can see the chat in case anything comes up. I can see you all, I can see my slides, I can see my notes. All right, let's do this. As Judy mentioned, I have the honor of teaching critical race theory at the University of Washington School of Law. I've been there since 2013, and actually even my presence there is the result of student activism when students pushed for someone to teach critical race theory. And so that's one of the themes I'm going to discuss today, how critical race theory itself encourages us to look at the places we study, like where you all students study, as themselves political sites, right? Sites of contestation. And so I often think about the way that, my ability to even do this job today is a result of students contesting to have this kind of subject in their curriculum. But I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit. What I'm going to be doing today in these 45 or 40 minutes is setting the scene a little bit, giving some background, then talking about what is critical race theory. I know that those of you in the class have been thinking about this now for a few weeks, but I'll sort of give you my quick and dirty version of it. There is no one like critical race theory canon, but I will talk about some basic ideas advanced by critical race theorists and how they connect to contemporary debates. And then I hope we have plenty of time for questions and for talking. So I'm just going to go ahead and jump in. To set the scene, I wanted to ground us in some stuff that's been happening here in Seattle, right? So in 2010, John T. Williams, who's pictured here, was shot and killed by a Seattle Police Department officer, Ian Burke, right? John T. Williams was a member of the Nootka tribe. He was a 7th generation woodcarver from a tribe from the Pacific Northwest. He had hearing difficulties and he was crossing the street just about a mile from my house, holding a small carving knife and a piece of wood, when a police officer basically shouted at him to stop because I guess he saw the small knife and felt threatened by it. And then when Mr. Williams did not stop, shot him 4 times and killed him. As a result of that and of other incidents like this one, a group of 35 community organizations in 2010, including organized by the ACLU of Washington, basically requested help from the federal government. They called on the Department of Justice to investigate, what they saw as excessive use of force and of biased policing against people of color. And as a result of that, since 2012, the Seattle Police Department has been under what's called a consent decree, right? So this means that the Seattle Police Department is under federal court oversight, where there's a judge who is looking at what the Seattle Police Department is doing, if they're improving their practices, if they're policing in a manner that actually complies with the Constitution and promotes, public confidence, right? What this has meant has been, since 2012 until now, an increase of about $200 million in the Seattle Police Department's budget in an attempt to remedy racist policing. So that happens in 2012. Then in 2017, we see the murder of Charlene Lyles, right? So Charlene Lyles was at home. She was a mom of 4 kids, was pregnant with another child, was experiencing a mental health crisis, called 911 for assistance, and the police who came to her house shot and killed her in front of her children, right? And so this is happening while the consent decree continues. There was a huge uproar around Charlene's death. And yet, time passed and it seemed like what was going to continue happening was more of the consent decree reforms, which are again, trying to find the bad apples within the Seattle Police Department and train people not to shoot and kill Indigenous and Black people and to pull them over at disproportionate rates, et cetera. So fast forward to 2020, right? This is a picture of outside of Seattle City Hall. Protests that erupted following the murders of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd. Many of you may have been part of the uprisings wherever you were at that time. And this time the demands, at least in Seattle, were a little bit different, right? This time, this is a picture of June 6, 2020, where 10,000 people marched to City Hall to demand that the mayor at the time and the city council defund the police department by 50%, invest that money in Black communities, and free all protesters, right? And so this is some art that came out of that moment here in Seattle with those 3 demands: defund the police, invest in Black communities, free protesters. For me, in that moment, both being part of this movement and then also thinking about and analyzing what happened then, CRT helps me think about that, right? So what explains these demands nearly 10 years into a consent decree meant to address quote unquote biased policing? What explains the way elected officials responded to the demands? What explains the initial commitment to defund the police? Because initially we had 7 out of our 9 council members, so a veto-proof majority agreeing to these demands. And then what explains the rollback, right? The retrenchment and the backlash that's happened since then. Critical race theory for me is one tool that helps me make sense of all of this and also helps guide mine and other people's scholarship and advocacy and organizing. So I just want to give that as a frame because I think oftentimes when we jump right into the theory, it can be a little hard to ground, like, you know, well, where does this all go? You know, as my students are constantly asking me, it's like, yes, I see the theory, but like, what does it mean in practice, right? So for me, I just want you to keep that in mind as we go through this explanation. So what is critical race theory, right? On a very basic level, despite what you may have heard on Fox News and elsewhere, critical race theory is basically an intellectual movement that began in legal scholarship, right? It's coming out of legal academia. Today, it continues to be an intellectual movement, but it's also now the body of scholarship that has developed over the years. And I think most importantly, an analytical tool set for interrogating the relationship between law and racial subordination. Right. And so this is scholarship that's coming out in the 1970s, 1980s from the post-civil rights era legal scholars, many of them who are Black scholars, who were seeing that the promises of the civil rights movement had not actually gotten us to the root of the problem, that ending racial segregation as a result of the civil rights movement, as a result of Brown v. Board of Education, had not actually ended racial subordination. So racial segregation no longer legal, racial subordination still rampant, right? So beginning in the late 1980s, there's a group of legal scholars who develop a position on race and the law, which has now come to be called critical race theory, that was really critical of 3 main things, right? They're criticizing class-based legal scholarship. So they're looking at the legal scholarship to the left of that time, which was very incisive in questions of class, but was in many ways completely eliding race. And so they're criticizing that. Then they're also looking at mainstream liberal legal scholarship, which is basically like claiming like mission accomplished on civil rights and saying, you know, we think there's shortcomings there as well. And then looking at traditional civil rights jurisprudence. So what had Brown v. Board of Education gotten us, right? If people were suffering from discrimination, racial subordination, what were the courts able to provide? And were those remedies that were actually ending you know, the disparate health outcomes for Black people, ending disparate school outcomes for Black folks, and ending racial subordination as we know it, right? So they're basically criticizing on 3 different levels at the same time. They're also kind of trying to advance a couple of intellectual commitments. I guess I described the first as, you know, saying that the liberal legal tradition that governs our political, our social, our economic institutions, and even laws that purport to advance like race neutrality, that all of that actually reflects the exercise of white racial power and also works to create and rationalize that power, right? So that the law isn't just reflecting, but actually constructing and naturalizing and justifying racial subordination, right? And that notwithstanding that first premise, that the law can be used to dismantle racial subordination, right? So this is both an intellectual commitment to talk about the reflection of white racial power, and the way in which law constitutes, is constitutive of racial power, and also is a call to action, right? That's saying, yes, we see this critique and we think there is still a role for the law to be a tool for dismantling racial subordination, okay? It's important to note that there isn't any one set of doctrines or one methodology, despite those like broad political commitments. In fact, most critical race theorists, you know, don't agree on, you know, they believe in the general idea of liberation and ending racial subordination, but don't agree on what it will take to get there or what it will look like when we're there, right? But these commitments remain there. So I think one useful way to think about this is to think about, well, what is it that critical race theorists are critical about, right? This is how I usually start my quarter with my students right now. I'm teaching CRT to 1Ls, to first year law students, and this is sort of our first question, like what makes this more than race theory, right? What is the critical in there? And so I'm just going to talk us through some basic ideas with over this next half hour, and then I really do welcome all of your questions. So I'm not really going to move from this slide. These are some of the basic commitments and ideas that have been developed over the years in critical race theory scholarship, and that have been in conversation with many movements, right? I think a lot of times my students sort of misunderstand the relationship between social movements and academia, and there really is a lot of back and forth, right? Critical race theorists are looking at what has been done, what is being done by social movements, and often pulling ideas and also obviously feeding ideas back into social movements. So the first of these basic ideas is a very basic one, right? Is the idea that race is socially constructed, right? That it is not biologically or genetically real, but that it is socially real, right? That it's socially relevant. And that because it's socially real, we need to be talking about it and studying it and thinking about it, right? That we need to be taking race into account. So in other words, that we need to have race consciousness, right? That race consciousness is a good thing. And this, might seem obvious to some folks, but it's actually much of this discourse related as pushback to the idea that is very clear in many legal decisions and many social policies that tell us that we're in a sort of post-racial moment, right? That there's something wrong about noticing race or talking about race or being race conscious, that we should be doing our best to be colorblind or to ignore race, right? So CRT, a very central thing about it is that it explores and rejects the myth of color blindness, right? So thinking back to my example of what's been happening here in Seattle over the last decade and the fights against racist police violence, right? CRT would encourage us to look carefully at the role that race played in the murders of John T. Williams and Charlene Lyles, right? It would encourage us to take a moment back and do deeply historical work. Critical race theory deeply historicizes. It would encourage us to think about the history of the Duwamish, the first people of Seattle, the people who were displaced to create the city of Seattle. It would have us connect the dots between the murder of John T. Williams by a Seattle police officer in 2010 and the fact that the very first law passed by the very first city council created in Seattle was a law that outlawed the presence of the Duwamish within Seattle city limits. And that the very first Seattle Police Department was created primarily to enforce that law. We have to be able to draw that through line between those two moments to really understand what's going on with John T. Williams's death, right? We have to then look at the fact that Native people are still the most likely to be disproportionately stopped by police in Seattle, even more than Black folks, right? A colorblind approach would say, race had nothing to do with this. This was a rookie cop who panicked and made a mistake, right? CRT would have us reject that and look further, and then also think about, well, given that, what is the answer? What action should come from that? And we'll talk about that in a sec. Another common idea in CRT is the second one I list here, which is that racism is not primarily about individual bad actors, right? And so this is something that, one of the precursors to critical race theory, a person named Alan Freeman talked about as a perpetrator versus a victim perspective. And he talked about how the law has become mired in the perpetrator perspective and the idea that we will resolve racism when we can catch the individual bad racists, and that is where anti-discrimination law ended up, right? And so we're in a situation now, for those folks who think about what can a lawsuit do to stop this, where we often have to, if you're suing someone for racial discrimination, you have to prove that they meant to do it because they are an individual racist. And this is an almost impossible hill to climb. And so, I used to work at the Northwest Immigrant Rights Project, and we would do work across the state, trying to stop basically racist police or racist ICE arrests and Border Patrol arrests of mainly Latinx people. And I remember one of my clients was arrested just literally walking down the road, actually around Moses Lake, close to Spokane. And the court, we were telling the court the only reason this person was stopped was because of his ethnicity, because he was Latinx, because he was a brown man. And the court said, well, what reasons did the police officer give? Did the ICE, the Border Patrol officer give for stopping him? The reason, and the Border Patrol said, well, it wasn't racism. It was because he was a block from a bus station and because he was facing north and Canada is north of us. It has made like absolutely no sense, right? Like, so he's a block from a bus station where many immigrants, I guess, cycle through, and he's facing Canada. So it's like, I guess, gonna walk over, 100 miles to the border. But that was enough, right? That was enough for the court because they said, aha, this is not an individual racist. This is just somebody who's doing his job, right? And so critical race theory critiques the fact that where anti-discrimination law has ended up is stuck in that perpetrator perspective and says, no, racism isn't primarily about individual bad actors. That yes, of course, there are folks who act with racist intent, but as long as the legal system remains mired in just saying like racism will be resolved when we pull out the individual bad actors, we're missing the larger story that racism is a normal feature of American society, not like a deviation from an otherwise fair and just status quo. So that once we get rid of the bad apples, like we'll be in the promised land, right? So this is where, again, going back to the example of the Seattle Police Department, CRT is what has helped me understand and analyze how a focus on going after the individual officer who killed John T. Williams or the two officers who shot and killed Charleena Lyles, and on creating accountability systems that cost millions of dollars to punish like other bad apples in the police department, that may not actually get at the root. That may not actually eliminate police violence, right? CRT encourages to ask new questions from what Alan Freeman calls a victim perspective, right? Different questions like, how do we create a city where Charleena Lyles would be so resourced that she would have what she needed to still be with us today, right? Where she had all the resources to address her ongoing mental health issues that led the police officers in part to shoot her, right? Where she was so resourced that her death would be unimaginable, right? How do we create more justice for Charleena Lyles and for John T. Williams than the systems that killed them can deliver, right? So that's another thing I want to leave you with, just that's beginning to question that like racism is about like individual bad actors. That's something that CRT has deeply, deeply contested over the years. Another basic idea advanced by CRT is basically a rejection of this idea of neutrality, right? CRT rejects the idea that scholarship or teaching can ever be neutral or objective, right? They reject the idea that there's like a fair and balanced way to talk about race. They say we can't ever write about race from a distance of detachment or with any sort of attitude of objectivity. Like there's no space outside of the social dynamics of racial power from which we could like observe and analyze, that we can't step outside of it. We're like too deeply steeped in it. So we need to, both understand and acknowledge that, right? Critical race theory would say that scholarship itself, right? How it's written, how it's published, how it's organized is inevitably political. That teaching itself, like what we teach, how textbooks are written, all of that is inevitably political. That what speakers any campus chooses to bring to their school and which speakers are never invited, what topics are presented to you and what topics aren't, that all of that is inevitably political. There is no neutral, right? And this is interesting to think about in context of the pushback on CRT that we're seeing across many cities and states, right? So, as I'm telling you, CRT is really like a movement that began in like legal academia. It wasn't like a topic to be taught in like K through 12. And yet it has been used as sort of a shorthand for the idea of teaching histories that delve into how this country was founded on, genocide and slavery, right? The pushback on CRT, where cities and states are trying to ban the teaching of these histories, that is a political move, right? Because there is no neutral US history, whatever the folks who are crafting those bills would have us try to believe, right? Whatever you choose to leave out of a curriculum or remove from a curriculum, whatever books you're trying to ban, that in itself is a political stance, right? If you're disengaging with the histories or trying to force your schools to disengage with the histories of the people who've been on the receiving end of racial oppression, if you're refusing to teach the history of how that racial oppression was created and maintained, then you're choosing a side actively, right? You're choosing the side of the privileged and the powerful who prefer the status quo, right? Who's for whom like continued racial oppression favors them and harms other, choosing a side of the folks who are terrified that this is going to be a country that is soon majority minority, where white folks will be in the minority, right? And are clinging to teaching the histories that erase oppression and therefore erase the ways that we might actually address and undo racial subordination. So that one is a big one, right? And it's one that I think my students really appreciate thinking about, because it has so many, there's so much that comes from that when we start pushing back on the idea of neutrality. Critical race theory, moving on to the next one, is also dissatisfied with traditional civil rights discourse. And this is one that a lot of my students have trouble with, because they often say, well, you know, I came to law school in part because like I've read these histories of the civil rights movement and I wanted to be part of like creating that legal change. When I talk about critical race theories being dissatisfied with traditional civil rights discourse, I don't want to say that they dismiss the advances of the civil rights movement, right? Critical race theorists will often recognize that like their generation of lawyers and professors from the 1980s and 90s, they were only in those law schools because of the advances of the civil rights movement, right? CRT itself is taught because there was a civil rights movement. But critical race theory wants to and tries to bring to light the ways in which this civil rights movement was in some ways de-radicalizing, right? That there was the taming of like a radical liberation movement by the American legal order, who came to be very focused on like individual bad actors, not you know, uprooting systems of oppression, right? So it criticizes why, like, instead of engaging in like a broad scale inquiry into why jobs and wealth and education and power are distributed as they are, mainstream civil rights discourse suggested and really became tied to the idea that once we rid ourselves of the irrational basis of race consciousness, once we became like colorblind and were post-racial, then everyone would be treated fairly as equal competitors and like a regime of equal opportunity. Critical race theory is also very critical of the results of Brown v. Board of Education, right? So the decision that declared school segregation illegal. As critical race theorist Angela Harris says, you know, with Brown, we won the battle, but ultimately we lost the war, right? It criticizes a lack of social change that the civil rights revolution engendered by Brown actually required, right? So with Brown v. Board of Education, the court said, you know, with all due speed, schools should be desegregated. You know, what followed was 20 plus, and actually litigation that continues to this day, to force schools to desegregate, because schools, you know, we're not going to do that without a fight. And what ended up happening is that lawyers became so tied to this vision of integration that they stopped focusing on actually improving educational outcomes for Black students. You know, the idea that integration would automatically do that ended up not being true. And yet, you know, attorneys sort of soldiered on with this like single-minded integration vision. And the system that was produced was one that was in many cases integrated, but where the same white administrators, white principals, white superintendents, white decision makers switched to being concerned about standards instead of being, you know, quote unquote, instead of being concerned about having Black students in their school, right? It's these same institutions that continue to disproportionately expel and suspend and punish Black students are found to be racially neutral, as long as they aren't like outwardly explicitly racist, as long as they have that one other reason for why they are suspending Black students in a disproportionate way, right? And so critical race theories really look at what Brown v. Board of Education required and have a criticism of like how much change didn't happen as a result, and how the demands being made by lawyers actually limited a more radical change that could have occurred that went deeper to the root of the problem, right? So, you know, ultimately criticizes the lack of social change that the civil rights revolution required. Another thing that they're critical of was actually law schools themselves, right? So the idea, and I think this now extends more broadly to other schools, but the idea that the law school itself was like a site of contestation was really a new one, right? The idea that power is implicated in privileging of certain topics and viewpoints as being like worthy of being included in the legal curriculum of mainstream law schools. They were very critical of that, right? Critical of the idea that like somehow knowledge and politics aren't like totally intertwined. they started looking at law schools themselves as like not just places of learning, but as workplaces that produce knowledge, right? Not just like these neutral places where you get tools to fight the good fight out there in the racist world, but that never themselves have that like mirror turned onto them, right? And I think this is a tradition that continues now. Again, when I think about like getting my job because students at UW were dissatisfied that there was no class like critical race theory on the curriculum, right? And in fact, critical race theory in part comes out of student organizing happening at Harvard during the 1980s, right? So Harvard law students were organizing to demand a class on race and demanding the hire of a Black professor. And Harvard basically responded saying, there are no qualified Black professors. Don't you just want the best professor, not a Black professor? And so students knew, there's something wrong with this kind of response, and they needed the language and the ideas to articulate what that was. And so much of critical race theory, this like critique of neutrality and the myth of color blindness comes out of that fight. So it offered basically a new story and a new interpretation for students who very badly needed that at the time. The last thing I want to talk about, and maybe we'll have more time for questions, is the way that critical race theory also offered a new story or new way of interpreting the way progress happens just overall, right? What some critical race theorists call these cycles of preservation through transformation, or of reform and retrenchment, right? And this is something that's been one of the most helpful things for me in terms of like applying critical race theory to the work I do both within and outside the university. So, the traditional story we're told and asked to buy into about racial progress in this country is that we're like moving in an upward arc, right? Like we're headed in the right direction, that we had slavery, but then like that ended, yay. And then we had Jim Crow and that ended, so awesome. Then we had the civil rights movement and that was successful. And now, we're in a moment where we've managed to elect a Black president and are in this like post-racial moment. Of course, all of that has been very complicated by, the following that first Black president by a white supremacist president, but this brings us exactly to this point, right? This idea of preservation through transformation or reform and retrenchment is the idea that there isn't just this upward arc, but that the line of racial progress in this country is something more like a wave, right? Preservation through transformation is a way of saying that when oppressed groups resist domination and are rising up against it, laws are changed just enough to address their complaints, but not to actually resolve the oppression. So that instead, the system changes just enough to preserve the status quo, right? So the system transforms enough and no more than needed to preserve the status quo. Okay, the same thing with these cycles of reform and retrenchment, right? That we push forward and then immediately have retrenchment, immediately have backlash, right? In some ways, this brings us back to, the attempts to like ban CRT in school, right? These are an attempt, I think especially following the uprising in 2020, which was a reckoning with racism's foundational role in this country, to attempt to like deeply historicize, to like pull the curtain back, right? To say, we're going to make it illegal to consider the foundational histories of racial violence, and we'll make it illegal to teach the kinds of concepts and histories that show us that this is not a colorblind country, nor has it ever been, right? And so we have this cycle like of reform, of people moving forward with a racial reckoning, and then a cycle of like deep retrenchment, and it's always contested, right? That's like, Kimberly Crenshaw, critical race theory says like, when we win, we lose. Like those two things like always go together. So all of this really brings me back to Seattle, right? So back to the demands that were made here in 2020. Critical race theory for me is a tool for really understanding and examining what's happened in Seattle in 2020, what happened in the years since I moved here in 2006, and what's happening now, right? So it helps me analyze the consent decree in a different light than my more like liberal legal colleagues do, where I look at the consent decree as a tool that was like designed to like root out the bad apples in the Seattle Police Department. Critical race theory helps us understand that racial violence is not an aberration or a glitch in the system of policing, that it is policing, right? So that focusing on reforms to to accountability structures that are meant to root out bad apples will not actually stop the harm, right? And in fact, in some ways, is very much a cycle of preservation through transformation, because the police department was transformed just enough to say, hey, ACLU and 35 orgs, we've got this covered, we're pushing back. Don't worry, we're giving $200 million new dollars to the police department to preserve them, right? So they are transformed in some very surface ways, but in fact, their power is preserved and in many ways, I think, increased by their ballooning budgets, right? So that is, critical race theory helped me have that, that analysis of what was happening. And then we see 2020, right? Where the uprisings come in and we start to see demands that are pushing back and saying, actually, we're not here to ask for yet another investment of more money to train the police department not to be racist and kill us. We're instead asking to begin dismantling the Seattle Police Department, to defund them by at least 50%, to invest that money in communities and to free all protesters, right? CRT to me gives me a lens into understanding those demands as trying to actually get to the root of the problem, right? That police can't be reformed, that there is no end to police violence against Black and Brown communities without a fundamental rethinking of what generates safety and whose safety we value, and that how we invest our city dollars should reflect those values, right? The demands here in Seattle, at least in 2020, were no longer about individual bad cops. It was about confronting a system steeped in racism by design that would need to be uprooted, right? And about what it would actually take to create real safety for the first time for Black and Brown communities. I feel like CRT helped us understand that we could try to legislate racial balance into our schools, and we could outlaw explicit racial discrimination and still see racial subordination today, right? And so that's the whole examination of Brown v. Board of Education and its aftermath. Applied to police, CRT helps us understand that we could change the rules, we could change the training, we could call for more police accountability, and we would still see racial violence, right? The folks who are calling to defund SPD even now are asking us to change the way that we think about policing and asking us to think about how the problems with policing are not about using the perpetrator perspective, right? Of thinking of racism and policing as a result of a few bad apples, and then if we eliminate them, somehow we'd have an ideal force that generates safety. Ultimately, and I'll end with this now, CRT recognizes that all scholarship and all teaching is political and tries to produce scholarship that hopes to dismantle and be part of movements to dismantle the systems that produce racial subordination. I'm very excited, to discuss and to hear your feedback on this. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to share some of these ideas with you.